So welcome everybody to our Bioregional Open Dialogue number 8. We have two fantastic guests, Gaya Herrington and Indy Johar, who will talk about the limits of limits, and we're going to explain a little bit more what that means in one of the next slides. My name is Ralf Thurm. I'm the managing director of R3.0. And together with Bill Bowie, our senior director, we're going to facilitate this 8th open dialogue on bioregionalism. First of all, what we want to do, just as an intro, I'm going to present a couple of engagement guidelines, or a little bit of engagement guidance. We're many here on the Zoom line. So we have to be all a little bit well-behaving, of course. And I also want to give a little bit of extra background on this series about our bioregional open dialogues. Then Bill is going to give us a bit of context on limits to limits, and we'll then introduce Gaya Herrington. And after Gaya spoke, introduce Indy Johar. And after he spoke, we will have a facilitated open dialogue of all of us. And then I'm going to show a last couple of slides for the closing of this session. So just for you to know, as I said, we're about 100 people and most likely becoming more than 100 people. We would ask you to please stay on mute. And we definitely welcome if you have your cameras on. It's always good to see who's there, especially also later in the dialogue part. But we also, of course, understand if you can't for this session or for parts of this session. We are also going to use the chat function. So if you have questions coming through from the presenters, and whatever comes up, please put these questions into the chat sidebar right as they occur. We'll collate in the background about these questions and cover them in the facilitated dialogue segment. So don't hold back with your questions. Put them into the chat sidebar and we'll take care of them. And for some of those questions, we may summarize or cluster them for efficiency reasons. For some of them, we also may ask you to voice your question yourself. But in that case, of course, we hope you can respect everyone by keeping your question succinct, so very much on the topic and, of course, respectful. You will also see here we have an extra open dialogue Google document, and the link will be visible in the chat. We use that for additional comments, and if you have additional resource links that you want to share with the group, please put those in there, because that also prevents distraction in the sidebar during the session. We will keep this document publicly accessible after the event as a living resource document, so we can always go back to this document and add references or take references from there. If you wish, please add your name before you contribute something there, so that we can identify who you are and from whom this contribution was. And as you have already seen, we are recording the session for public posting on our Open Dialogues landing page. The video will also be on our YouTube channel, as well as the slide deck of today and the link to the Open Dialogue Google document will also be visible in the Open Dialogue landing page of our website. So you're not missing anything, and all information will be made available for you. Just as a little bit of background before we dive into today's session, this Open Dialogue series started in 2024 because there was popular demand for spaces to delve deeper into collective thinking. And we did 2 sessions in 2024, and then with our strategic move towards bioregioning in 2025 and fully devoting ourselves to bioregioning, we also devoted this series to bioregioning in 2025. And we did 6 sessions in 2025 And then one first session we already had in January with David Bollier and Natasha Hilst on relationalized finance in bioregional contexts. So there's a whole stock of sessions that you can also refer to. All of them are also available on the Bioregioning Open Dialogues landing page. In addition to that, we also did a second series, which was also launched late in 2024 and then moved into 2025. And we're now also thinking about moving this forward into 2026 around bioregional carrying capacities. So that is very much, to say it in one sentence, how are we going to measure success in bioregions? And very much also takes forward R3.0's thinking around thresholds and allocations. So this session is a separate session, but it's also fully available on the Bioregional Carrying Capacity sessions part of our website. And with that, I'm going to stop my introduction. I'll hand it over to Bill for today's session about limits of limits. Over to you, Bill.
Great, thanks, Ralph. And thanks to all of you for attending. Thanks in particular to Gaya and Indy. And I will make my opening contextualization brief. As Ralph mentioned, we at R3.0, this kind of merges our open dialogue series with our past carrying capacities, bioregional carrying capacities series into an open dialogue implementation of this. The idea behind this particular session really kind of emerged from two things. One is that we had invited Gaya to join our steering board, and we were very pleased that she said yes. And so that has happened. And so, we've been in background conversations with Gaya about applying her limits to growth updating research and other experience to the bioregional context. So that was a conversation that was going on in the background. And then on a LinkedIn post I had that Indy made, I had asked something about, how does this apply to the planetary boundaries? And Indy wrote back a fairly lengthy response to me directly around how the planetary boundaries is a good starting point, but we really need to mature them from there. And I'm not going to steal any of his thunder, but just by way of saying that these two things were happening kind of concurrently, and it seemed to make sense to really focus this session on that. So the last thing I'll say in terms of sort of setup for this conversation is just pointing to this study that just came out, I think, earlier this month, that's taking a look at the planetary boundaries framework. And what it notes is that there is an inconsistency between how it measures climate change or the greenhouse gas cycles and how it measures other biogeochemical processes, in particular nitrogen and phosphorus cycles. And what it notes is that we're looking at the stocks in terms of the climate system, but we're looking at the flows when it comes to nitrogen and phosphorus and other cycles. And so what it points out, or what it suggests, is, well, we should really have consistency in how we are measuring these. We should either do all stocks or all flows. And it turns out that measuring the stocks of nitrogen, for example, would be nearly impossible, because it would require looking at those stocks over a sort of millennial scale measurement time period. And so they harmonize around flows. And what you can see here in this chart is that climate change goes off the charts and becomes the biggest planetary boundary breach, instead of being surpassed by novel entities and biosphere integrity, for example. So that's just one example of what we might call the limits to limits, or how this process of looking at sustainability thresholds as they're sort of more generally considered, the ecological ceilings and social foundations, as Kate Rayworth calls them, that we need to have continual development of this of our thinking around these dynamics. So I'm going to leave it at that just to kind of prime the pump and hand it over to Gaya. We don't do long introductions here at R3.0 because we figure that you all are computer savvy and you can look up Gaya's bio on your own. But again, I will reiterate that Gaya has just joined us on the R3.0 steering board, which we are pleased as peach here on our end. And really looking forward to what Gaya has to share in terms of applying the research that she's done over many years around the limits to growth to the bioregional context. So Gaya, over to you.
Yes, thank you. I'm very happy to be here. I'm looking forward, especially to the discussion afterwards. Let me quickly do go into the slideshow. So limits has been kind of they've been my guide throughout my journey. And so when we're going to talk about limits, it's really a little bit in my journey in sustainability in a nutshell. So it started, we have to start where at the beginning with the limits to growth. I'm not going to go into that too much. I think most people will be familiar with that. It was a bestseller in 1972, done by a group of MIT scientists with at the time first of its kind world model. And they ran different scenarios with that model. Here you see four of those. And my career started in this sense 5 years ago when I did an update on that. And so I compared some of these scenarios with empirical data. And so what I found was a fairly close alignment, especially with the business as usual scenario, which, as you can see here, showed a steep decline setting in around now. So that the technical term there is collapse. That was published in Yale's Journal of Industrial Ecology. And then it went unexpectedly viral. So you see some of the headlines here. Editors love the word collapse. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more because it's not, it's a much more nuanced dynamic than you typically see in your average, let's say, zombie apocalypse movie or something, or the media, right? It doesn't matter, but whenever you have these apocalyptic movies, there's just mass panic and ashes from the sky, and there's zero coordination apparently between people. So what I found at the time is, do you see it here on the left lower? And I did a lot more variables than just this one, but this is for the human welfare variable, which is arguably the one we're most interested in. So the purple dashed line is the empirical data. And then we have here four scenarios. So it was an overall close alignment and most closely aligned with business as usual too, which I think is the climate change proxy scenario. And what you see here is some of these show a steep decline, but not all of them. And I think that was important. So this close alignment to me said, okay, well, that means the model is useful. All models are wrong. Some are useful. If we think this is useful, then we should heed its message. And there were no scenarios where growth continued forever. So the message is we don't have to go down, but growth will halt. And then we can choose our own limits and maintain what we have now. Or we can choose to, with a doomed attempt at keep growing, and then we'll lose much more of it in a steep decline from a previous peak, which is the technical term again is collapse. So since then, my journey was okay, well, if you need to let go of growth anyway, if you want to go for the design option, what should be what is a better goal than growth? And I thought that was human and ecological well-being. And so since then, I was sometimes introduced as a well-being economist it is not the only. We have several terms now. We have donut economics, of course, just post-growth, full circle, indigenous economy. But I think it's all very similar in the sense that growth is not a good goal. All those frameworks agree on that, and then it needs to center instead around something that makes us servants of life. That's ultimately what it comes down to. So that is what I also stressed more in my book, which was a data up was a little bit of an update, the latest data, but the same conclusion in terms of alignment, and but also the opportunity in that, the beauty that you see in limits. Um, since then, my book at the time was called Five Insights for Avoiding Global Collapse. I will say that since a year and a half, I've let that go. I don't think it's possible to avoid collapse anymore. I think we're already in it. I've held out longer than, for example, than other people, including Ralph and Bill. And I always knew it was a very low probability scenario I was going for, but I did feel that I was always a bit uncomfortable when there was, but with all due respect to Bill and Ralph, a middle-aged white guy going, "Yeah, well, collapse is unavoidable." And I'm like, "Yeah, that's easy for you to say. You're not gonna bear the brunt of it. It's gonna happen to all of us, but not equally." So I always felt that the privilege I had was at least a responsibility to give up last until the probability was really zero. But I think the probability is zero because we're already in collapse now. And so for the past year and a half, I've been on this journey that you can summarize in, okay, now what? What do we go for then? And I think I'm not alone in that. When I talk to people, it's a very broadly carried sense that things are about to change. And not necessarily just with the ecosystem, that too. But you see this with the United Nations, World Bank, IMF. They starting to use these words too, which is fairly new. They were in the past, they were very hesitant to use so-called emotional or political words. But the UN are also speaking about a global water bankruptcy, or the World Bank is talking about ecosystem breakdown. So it's widely understood, and even those that are not that interested still in environmentalism, they also sense it because they see it in our governance systems. Because that's, of course, the thing. It's not just the ecosystem, all these things are interacting. And that's what the World Economic Forum, for example, calls the poly crisis. But that's what this is. This is that the authors of The Limits to Growth talked about that too. They said before we run out of all clean air and arable lands and clean water, fossil fuels, we will run out of our ability to cope. That's the first thing. So that's what this poly crisis is. It's humanity running out of its ability to cope. And it's collapsologists describe that very well. It's if we're at the peak right now, which the limits to growth scenarios would suggest, then we're right at this thing where we reach the peak and then we're about to go down. So it's only most of us still are surrounded by things that we've always been surrounded with while growing up our entire lives. And yet, I think there's this pervasive, ominous uncertainty that we feel. We all feel like it's mostly still there, but it feels super fragile. And that's this thing. It's this very early onset of collapse in everything. So not just ecosystem, but also our governance systems and that sort of thing. So how do you work through that, right? How do you go from um, collapse avoidance to collapse resilience? That's a term that I learned from R3. So I'm equally thrilled to be here because of that, because I learned a lot from Bill's framing of, okay, collapse awareness, avoidance, and then acceptance. And then how do you work in resilience and ultimately uh, build back better? Because that's the way forward. And I think that's an important thing to do for us because collapse is not the end of what we call civilization or society. It's certainly not the end of humankind. More than anything, it's a flattening of current power structures and Goliath's Curse, a book that came out by a Cambridge scholar, Luke Kemp, last year, also describes that. This notion that we get from movies, right? Whenever there's a disaster, then everybody is just in complete panic. He says that's actually also the 1%'s view. The 1% by far has the most to lose in a collapse. And so that's something that I think is important to realize. I don't want to minimize what global collapse is, the suffering and destruction, but it is also a time of unprecedented potential to finally rebuild a new and much better system. So how do you do that? I think you do have to start with this narrative. We've all been told this narrative that we're um, uh, selfish people who need law and order. Otherwise, it's just complete chaos, right? That's also underlying in these panic scenarios that we see in these doomsday movies. And it's also this notion of that's why we can't govern our commons. We have to have either a company, a private sector, or government do it for us, because together we're just not communicating and we're just going to selfishly maximize. And that's this story of separation that we tell about who we are. And it's not really how we in practice behave. And so we have, I do think, to really make a new system and not recreating the old one. We have to start with this new story of interdependence that, of course, is preserved around the world, and perhaps best in indigenous communities by now. But the story that we are nature. We're not defending nature. We are nature. And we have our basic needs, and we can be aggressive and violent and short-term thinking and selfish when those basic needs are unmet. But once they are, we are much more curious and playful and altruistic than this Homo economicus kind of person could ever be. And we, at that point, we rejoice by just contributing to this web of life that we feel in our bones we are part of. And a spiritual need to contribute to that. So that's the first where you start to recognize when you're being told the separation myth and switch to interdependence. The engine of life is not competition, for example, it's cooperation. We can work together in partnership instead of these hierarchies that we supposedly need, these stark that drive these stark inequalities. So throughout our history, we've more organized around this kind of partnership model, as Rihanna Eisler describes it, much more than this domination. These domination organizational forms, such as in empires, they always have an expiration date. They cannot last because they are inherently unsustainable. But people are capable of living in a very sustainable way. We're not the apex predator, we're a keystone species. So we can play a very vital role in actually maintaining and regenerating this web of life that we're part of. And that's what we're currently in. This, if you want to be part of this new systems change, you have to have this attitude of have midwife, have hospice. The old system is dying. Its last death throes are very violent. So that's the hospice part. And there's the midwife part. This new system is already emerging, and that's also a very raw and painful process. But it's nice to have a midwife there, as I have had two home births, so I know. And that's also that's how you want to help this new system come into existence in this world. Now, for me, bioregionalism encompasses all those things. And obviously, it uses real nature, natural boundaries like watersheds to describe a bioregion. So it's not these fairly arbitrary and, of course, colonial borders that we sometimes see. But it is also very much a new governance and much more egalitarian, so social aspects that make it work as well. So we have these whole series in R3. So I'm not going to get too much into what is bioregionalism because that's been covered. But that is where limits guided me towards this bioregionalism approach. And because this is the limits of limits. I wanted to leave you with this, where I am in my journey right now, which is this is the notion of what limits really mean. Because for me, and this is not people use limits or boundaries or borders in different ways, but for me, I've come to use limits and boundaries interchangeably. But for me, these are much more part of the story of interdependence. And for me, boundaries and limits, when we use those in a more story of separation framing, they're not really limits. They're demarcation lines. They're borders. And for me, those are very distinctly different. If you look at demarcation lines are things of like they're always meant to divide or to enclose, to keep people out, keep stuff in so we can accumulate it. And it can be physical or a social construct, right? Mine, yours, that sort of thing. For me, limits and boundaries are very different. These demarcation lines, these borders are fairly arbitrary, but you can pinpoint them. They're typically rigid. That's the entire point. These hierarchies also they're rigid. They're meant to divide, but limits and boundaries for me are very different. And that doesn't you cannot pinpoint them because they're completely contextual, but they are vital for a thriving life. That's how I see them. They are guides. Planetary boundaries are now guiding us back home and remind us to return to place. We need limits and boundaries to get a sense of purpose, a common goal. And it's where we learn. It's really, it's I sometimes say for a child's mind, limits are limiting, but a mature mind knows that's where life happens. This where you bump into limits and then learn to work with them and live with them. That's what bioregionalism is as well. You bump into the limits and then you co-create these elegant solutions. And while doing that with one another, you create connection with each other, shared purpose. Without limits, what we do is limitless. It's meaningless, right? You can't find purpose when potential is truly unlimited. Also, nothing is real. And when you can never have enough, it's hard to feel that you ever are enough. And so I think we need these limits in a very spiritual and emotional sense as well. I also think they're very different in terms of demarcation lines that they cannot be pinpointed.
I'm gonna leave
It,
home.
if someone, I think someone is off mute.
Hey, I just got done with Dr. Rose.
And what's your name?
Love.
Okay. Uh, so I'll hand it over to Indy.
Okay.
Is that something safe or
But
no?
No, all set?
Yeah, all set.
Thanks.
all right. Can somebody mute themselves? Because I hear a whole story about the doctor,
Oh,
and it's a little bit distracting.
I thought that was your background guy. I'm glad. Thanks.
No, yeah, no, it wasn't me. But I looked into Indy's work a little bit before we started here, and I liked I really I think what he said aligns with what I say here, which is these boundaries they're very real in the sense that we need them, but you can't pinpoint them. Boundaries their integrity are vital for maintaining well-being. For example, my personal boundary, um, if my boss puts his hand on my knee, it's a whole thing. It's a shock to the system, and our dynamics will never be the same. But it doesn't mean that my boundaries are at my knees, because when my husband does it, or when a toddler does it, any kind of toddler really, it's totally fine. It's normal. So the boundaries are completely contextual. They change depending on who you are connected to. So that's just my latest thinking about what I think our limits are and how beautiful they are. And I hope that is a nice segue to Indy's part.
Hey, thank you so much, Gaia. You've already really spurred a lot of questions and conversation in the sidebar. feel free to take a look at the sidebar. We'll be answering those questions later. But thank you very much. And thank you to all the folks sending your reactions. I think that sets us up really well for the rest of this conversation. And thank you also for weaving your thinking with that of Indy's. So as a transition to Indy, I'll just note that a big thanks to Indy from Dark Matter Labs. He's spoken a number of times in our conferences, and some of his work has sort of referenced R3.0's work and vice versa. So there's a really, I think, healthy ecosystem of exchange. And so, Indy, you agreeing to come here to this conversation and share your thinking about this prompt of limits to limits is really appreciated. So over to you.
Thank you. Firstly, just such an honor to be in this room. Many brilliant people here. And I think, Gaya, thank you so much for that talk. It's such a pleasure to hear. Such a pleasure to hear you, but also just how much important work you've just done is extraordinary. So thank you. I'm not going to do a big presentation. I wanted to just share a reflection into the limit to limits conversation and where there's two entry points, and I'm going to start with one point was just I was in a situation meeting room generated by Olivia Lazard and her work in Europe and Brussels. And in that situation meeting room, there was a conversation going on about the AMOC current. And in the kind of representation of the likely risks that we're facing with regards to the AMOC current collapse was a model. And in that model, there was this current state and future state. And between the current and the future state, there was this gray box. And the gray box was between those worlds. And so the question, I ended up having a bit of a question. It's like, so what's happening in that gray box? And one of the things that became very apparent in that conversation was that we were modeling end states. But actually what the most scary positions was the volatility positions. When you have systematic volatility. And one of the conjectures, and also we did a piece of work focused on the Himalayas, we were looking at these volatility effects, these cascades across systems. And what we started to see was that there was the propensity to go from a relatively minor local event to a regional significant event was getting higher as a result of the coupling of different limits or fields. So whether that's water with food prices, food price shocks coupled with underlying resilience in terms of cost of diesel shocks, and that driving very quickly to political fragility, because actually the political infrastructure is relatively fragile in terms of its capacity to hold power, to get using othering as a very powerful device and tipping into war quite quickly. And this coupling between biophysical events with underlying loss of resilience actually was much more, there was a higher propensity of those cascades to quasi-existential or certainly systemic risks was becoming more and more real. And a lot of the risk literature and comprehension, or the thresholds literature, was focused on these single point moments, whether it's water or contamination or other things. But what was actually much more worrying was this move from biophysical to social contract loss, and the feedback that drives very quickly. And so what that started to open up for me was a really fundamental conversation, which is that one of the things as we move through, as we start to see cascades of risks, what you end up is an environment where I think we are also facing is a propensity for a system to move towards authoritarianism as you start to see degenerative volatility. So as the volatility of an environment grows, there's a kind of pre-allocation of power to dampen that volatility. And typically it's not anti-fragility or resilience, because we've got passive state structures which are rooted in control, there's a kind of drive towards concentration of control as a first order means of managing it. It's a very failed model of managing that volatility and loss of resilience, but the current architecture, industrial architecture, has a propensity to accelerate towards control as opposed to accelerate towards anti-fragility or resilience as a kind of system capability. So one of the things that started to worry me was that our horizon scenarios, so we did quite a lot of work on 3-degree futures or -20 +40 futures in the UK, was that we were often working to end state problems. And actually what started to worry us much more was closer horizons of volatilities and their propensity to move us towards both authoritarianism, but simultaneously move us in the loss of social contract. And those risk profiles are much more immediate, and they have a pathway for driving for driving significant conflict and war internally and externally than I think we were certainly recognizing. So I won't sort of limit other people's thinking. I think many people may have already figured this out. So from our perspective, what became really critical was like looking at these zones of these collapses of optionality, or the collapse of these cascade failure points, where you could turn a relatively a localized risk into a cascade failure, and what that would mean in terms of actually turning into whether a runaway conflict and other frameworks. Now, why this becomes important is that your responses to this become, firstly, in terms of how do you preserve foundational economy stability, energy, food, water, nutrition, biomaterial base, minimum biomaterial base, all the way to cognitive security. So your attention span starts to move towards actually continuity economics. And we've been doing quite a lot of work on how do we move from market-based economics to security economics, and what is a framework that allows us to be able to move towards a security economics position. And how do you do security economics driving anti-fragility as opposed to concentration of control and instructionism? I think that's a design problem that I think we're facing. And so the risk that we're running in our models is basically runaway conflict coming much earlier in the system, and both internal social contract loss and between nations or between cultures social contract loss, which actually drives this. And this requires us to actually build a different theory of foundational security and stability, and an economic model which allows us to be able to stabilize those critical conditions. Now, here's where it gets slightly difficult for me, and again, I'm talking amongst friends. What I'm worried about is that if you cascade into conflict, I'm not sure we have the cultural resilience to pull ourselves out from it. And secondly, the asymmetric cost of violence, i.e. the cost of violence being so small right now, large-scale violence being so small, that the propensity for self-termination will massively accelerate in the system. And this means that we have to start to think about preventative peace as an aversion to total as an existential risk because of the cascade effects. And our economics have to now be more and more focused on total value at risk. Just to give an example of that, so London, for example, and this is not total value, but it's a significant component, has 3.8 million homes. Each home is worth 668,000. That means the total residential value of London is about 2.52 trillion. And what we need, the economics and the financial arguments have to be managed on the basis of total value at risk, rather than marginal gains and resilience costs of insurance costs of stability at the front end side of it. And I think there's something extraordinary going on in terms of both the economic debate, the continuity debate in terms of how do you construct continuity in systems, as well as understand these risk profiles fundamentally differently. And I suppose I'm going to stop there because I think there's loads of questions that we could probably all get into in some of these pathways, and I yeah, and that's the parts that I'm deeply worried about. And why I think about this in terms of limit of limits is that these cascades are far more significant than the breaches of its single point limits now, because the systemic vulnerability that's being coded into the system is so high that these cascades, the Markov's blankets, are basically we're recoupling the world. The whole world is becoming much more recoupled, and the risks are recoupling the planet. And that recoupling means that actually we're starting to become systemically entangled, forcibly so, if we like it or not. And I think that requires a kind of paradigm change in how we recognize those risks and operationalize into those risks, and also recognize boundary of risks, right? So, like the UK is existentially entangled with the viability of the Antarctica and the Amazon and Congo. So you start to think about sovereign risk not as a bounded problem, but as a relational problem in fundamentally different ways. So, which I think is opening up a whole series of work on sovereign risk theory and how this links to various other frameworks all the way along that line. I'm going to stop there, Bill. Hopefully, that's enough of a flavor to say why we think the limit of limits, in a way, is a very relevant frame, and it's opening up a different pathway of thinking about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Indy. As usual, a very thought-provoking provocation. I guess that's the term we use in our conferences. And so between Gaya and Indy, there is plenty to discuss here. There's already a long queue of questions in the sidebar, and I imagine more will be coming as we speak. So I want to start with actually the first question that came in that I don't think I've heard addressed by either Gaya or Indy. And that was Raman Frey said, how do we operationalize a subordination of human desire and consumption to the needs of a flourishing biosphere? So Gaya, why don't we start with you on responding to that one?
Yes, so I feel like there are some assumptions in there underlying that question that I would challenge. Um, I think first of all, we should be very clear about separating wants and needs. When we talk about this, when I say we have to replace growth with human and ecological well-being, our well-being is obviously very much a large part of that is satisfying of our needs, not necessarily our wants. And they are actually very different. We're not taught this because if the economy is growth-based, which it is right now, then focusing on human needs is not a good strategy, because contrary to wants, human needs can actually be satisfied. So we do not need an endless amount of stuff to satisfy them. Very basic need is food, for example. Not enough food is definitely detrimental, and too much also. So there's with needs, it's very clear that you have this optimum, this balance, and this concept of enough. Wants is very different. Wants can be they're endless. They're also endlessly varied, which is not true for needs. Our human needs are universal, and how we satisfy them, there are large differences between cultures, and those are ideally shaped by the local environment, but they are nonetheless they are satisfiable. And I think what we've done here, marketing is an excellent example. It really ties products to needs in order to keep selling. You're not buying a deodorant, really. You're buying a chance to meet people of the opposite sex who are just enticed by the smell. So all of marketing and influencing is based on tying things subconsciously to our needs, including the emotional ones, and which are actually not that easy to satisfy with products. So our basic needs, food, shelter, that all makes total sense. That does require some material, but if there's a certain point you're satisfied there, and then our needs become more emotional and spiritual. And those actually, if you try to satisfy those with more products like we're doing today, it actually doesn't work. It's a simulacrum. It's a pseudo satisfier. And that's why we're seeing so much loneliness today. This current economy does a very poor job in satisfying our emotional and spiritual needs, including our sense of connection, but of course also a need for a sense of purpose, which it's a human need. So even people who are affluent in this economy, the supposed winners, are plagued by loneliness and a sense of like, my job is just tricks for money, and that is a mental suffering. So to be honest, the answer to your question is I don't think we have to do that. We don't have to we don't have to like subdue or rein in our instincts. We have every right to express a need for food, etc. But after that, our needs are for a sense of purpose and that sort of thing, and that's highly immaterial. So I don't think it's actually necessary to impose anything on us.
Thank you, Gaya. Indy, do you have thoughts to add here?
Yeah, so I think there's multiple, just building on what Gaia said and sort of adding to it. I slightly worry that we've ended up taking a very singular economic view on everything. Intangible goods and intangible economies are fundamentally different economies to scarce material economies. Biomaterial economies are fundamentally different economies to scarce material economies. Simultaneously, whether it is economies of care are fundamentally different economies to sort of intangibles economies. And I think one of the biggest challenges that we've got is we've single-classed and have a compressed view of the economy through too similar a lens, rather than recognizing these as differential economies with fundamentally different characteristics and fundamentally different behaviors. And for me, that's a really important point. So what's the role of sufficiency? Sufficiency is not the same. Where do we need to be sufficient as an economy and drive an economy of sufficiency? Where do we need to drive an economy of stewardship, material stewardship? Where do we start to drive an economy of reproduction and care? Where do we drive an economy of infinite value in intangibles? And I think we have to design economies which are in parallel with these limits and capacities of the system, which are layered. And this allows for an infinite expansion of the human potential, whilst recognizing the sufficiencies necessary for certain minerals and mineral environments and other things, water systems and other things. So I think one of the questions for me is, I would totally agree with the whole thing about, I worry that the whole degrowth narrative has been too narrow a political conversation. We've been trapped because the degrowth, obviously I don't mean intellectually, I mean politically. It's allowed itself to become trapped into kind of the holder of zero-sum games or zero-sum economics, whereas actually I think what we are talking about is a different layered theory of growth. So, if we can get to circularity of materials, there is a different theory of growth. If we can get to economies of care, there's a different theory of growth. So I think what we have to have is a more nuanced conversation about economies, rather than what I would think has been largely an activist conversation about economic transitions, which has just left us polarized rather than being able to build the new consensus across the system. And I think that requires a different political theory that we wrap our economy around, and also creating the institutions that build those economies. So soil valuation of soil, valuing soil, all the way through to, like I said, the kind of fundamental deficits in we do not value care. That's a fundamental basis of all of our economy as it operationalizes. So I would just, and that this matter, I'm not just talking about this in a lucid, in a sort of nice to hand waving sums. I'm talking about discount rates. I'm talking about what are the actual structures of these economies post ownership. Like, do you own critical mirrors, or are you only a steward of those materials? Are they effectively public leases to a whole chain? So I'm talking about the actual institutional layers that organize those economies, and then what are the financial wrappers into those economies? How do you finance those layers in fundamentally different ways? So just to add that other dimension to what Guy was saying.
Thank you, Indy. And Gaya, I did see a facial expression that suggested you might have some input on that, the particular post-growth question. So I'll put that back to you briefly before we go to the next question.
Yes. Sorry, could you repeat the question? Because I'm glad you followed my mimicry, but I'm not sure.
Just if you had when Indy was talking about post growth, and I know that your work focuses on post growth, and so Indy in some ways you could say is talking post growth, or a more nuanced take on post growth. So I just wanted to give you an opportunity to chime in. There's plenty of other questions that we can move to, but I just wanted to not miss that opportunity for you to chime in on that.
Yeah, okay. I think you meant a degrowth when I think I made an expression when Indy was talking about the zero sum in degrowth. Yes.
Thank you. I did use the wrong word there. Thank you, Gaya.
Yeah, that's okay. Yes, I think I can see that. I will be honest. I think I think we mostly agree post growth, degrowth, even collapsologists. Now you see that all these fields, also even more mainstream fields like risk management, they're starting to converge very much in what they're saying, because so many options for humanity have been closed off by now, simply. And for example, collapsologists were on the opposite side of degrowth in a way. They were both fairly fringe, but collapsologists always said it's not possible to do this. Well, the systems change. And degrowthers were like, no, we're going to focus on, and I agree that they were very much focused on mostly policy. And in that sense, I recognize what some of the things that Indy was saying about that, because it's that's just my own journey, and I know Ralph went through the same one. Ralph was at Siemens, I was at Schneider Electric, so we a lot of us, many sustainability people started in the green growth camp, and then we were like, okay, well, we have to change the system, but maybe we can still do that from within the system. And you started working at these multinationals because there was a lot of leverage there. And for the past year and a half, I've come to the conclusion that it's gonna happen through disaster, and that's what collapsologists, for example, always said. They said it doesn't matter that the economy is a social construct. A train is made completely by humans too. And yes, you can still change impacts once you're at the early beginning stage when you're drawing up the schematics. But once you've built the entire train, built the entire infrastructure it's on, and then you set it off. Once it's running, it doesn't matter that at some point every single person on a train agrees you should probably have built it with brakes. The only way it's going to stop now is through a collision. So that's just the collapsologist view. And I think whether they were always right or not doesn't matter anymore. It doesn't matter how you got there. We're all converging here. And I do think that degrowth also focuses very much on commoning, etc. So I don't think it's the discrepancy is that big, but I do recognize the focus on the politics a lot. While I do think that ultimately it's more of it's going to be an interstitial process. So you work in the cracks of the braking system, and you crystallize, you build up in a fractal way, ultimately to the global. But I think that's going to be the way forward, rather than trying to convince more policymakers. If people want to do that, I think that's great. That's part of the solution too. Government is still going to be there, but I've now decided that I want to focus on rebuilding this muscle of community strength through this co-created solutions and self-provisioning systems.
Thanks, Gaia. And that leads to our next question. But Indy, I did see your hand up there. Did you want to chime in briefly before we go to the next cue?
Yeah, no, I think where I wanted the current the pathway worry I'm holding is that actually as we go towards this future, let's use the word collapse, what we will embrace is authoritarian governments. Right? Those two things are co-joined, unfortunately or fortunately, whichever way you're inclined. So the authoritarian government is co-joined with the train wreck. And the authoritarian government will also thereby set us on path to a form of violence. And my worry is I don't think we get out of the violence loop. So I agree with the kind of analysis of the train wreck. My worry is when we seed that violence loop, we can't get out of it because, like I said, the unit cost of violence now is so low relative to scale of effect. And if you generate vast amounts of people whose families have been killed or murdered, you will generate people who will have the right to burn the system down in any way they want, emotionally. And so I think the thing we have to worry about is how do we pivot that risk? Because I think that risk is manifest and real. And I think there's something really important. And this is partly where there's some hope I have, which is that if the River Danube was a means that we discovered international waters, what is the equivalent of the River Danube in the 21st century? What are critical transnational goods that are so existentially real that unless you get states and state systems to be able to, and multi-agent systems to be able to recognize that critical dependency to pathways or risks, and if you can get that recognition to occur, you can start to actually build a new institutional hardware that allows for actually systemic renewal. So the kind of key tipping points in those tipping point locations, maybe, whether it's glacier systems in the Alps or whether it's hydrological rivers that actually become so existential with the AMOC current collapse. And so there's a point to me of like, where do we get this new locations? And I think bioregions are brilliant because they are at the heart of multi-solving a whole bunch of risks because they are the location where you can multi-solve energy, water, nutrition cycle, all the way through to biomaterial base as well as democratic participation. So there's a brilliant, and they've all got multiple entry points. So some bioregions are building from the farming side, some bioregions are building from the watershed side, some bioregions are building from the fire risk side. So we've got multiple investment strategies coming in and multiple investment pathways. And I'm just thinking about this sort of this system collapse risk at a macro level as well and how we hold that. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you, Indy. Gaia, let me just ask the next question first, because I think it actually circles back in on the issue that we're addressing here. This is from Menno Lammers, and Menno writes, bioregionalism invites us to organize around watersheds, soils, climate zones, and living systems rather than GDP, borders, and trade flows. But it raises a provocative tension. If today's nation states are fragmented by economic logic, could bioregionalism risk becoming a new form of fragmentation, this time organized around ecological boundaries? Are we simply replacing one organizing principle with another? Is bioregional a regenerative shift towards life-centric coherence, or could it become a new fragmentation of limits where ecological boundaries harden into the same kind of structural constraints we once built around economic ones? Are we redefining borders or redefining belonging? And how do we ensure that limits become conditions for regeneration rather than new walls of separation? So I think you can see how this ties into that very question of conflict versus peace that you mentioned earlier. So Gaia, maybe over to you for a first crack at this excellent question.
Yes, I agree. And we're touching on the governance aspect here, which is of course top of mind because I live in the US, so we're clearly devolving into fascism. There's no denying that. I'm just incurable. I do feel a sense of duty to not give up and just surrender to the inevitability of fascism, authoritarianism before all other pathways are explored. I do think there's an alternative that I want to work towards. There's clearly a huge risk of going there to what would probably be a form of eco-fascism. I think limits, now that they're forced upon us, will drive us to be more environmentally conscious because we just have to. But that can still come in some kind of form of eco-fascism. And of course, we want to have that in a different way where we have, for me, that is what bioregionalism is. Bioregionalism is very much also about inherent egalitarianism, democratic decision-making, empowerment for everybody. And so I don't think that could be a new form of that kind of totalitarianism, even in a fractal way. I just don't think it wouldn't be bioregionalism anymore. It would just be a fractal way of having another form of authoritarianism. I do think that bioregionalism in that sense is also key to avoiding to turning around this fascism. And the reason is that when you look at social science, the empirical findings, also what you see in surveys, what people say they value, what you see is that the majority of people actually are very egalitarian. We still have that brain of the hunter-gatherers, which is incredibly social. We are literally wired to be for pro-sociality, for cooperation, that can be perverted with artificial hierarchies, but we are wired for connection. That is why still the most severe punishment, even when you're already punished and in prison, is put in isolation. It hurts us. It's so against our nature to be disconnected. So I do think that once that those hierarchies that were imposed of us and made us behave in ways that I think are not that natural to us, when that collapses, there is more potential for us to start doing that, what we've been doing for most of the time that the homogeneous was around. And I think why we haven't done that to sufficient extent before is because the system was designed for us to be disempowered. When we are completely dependent on this system for survival, we will literally die. You can choose to not participate and you will die because you will not have food or shelter because you don't have a right in this system. But your rights are allocated according to how much money you have. So you have to participate in the system. That doesn't mean you actually like it or that it suits you well. When you go to this self-sufficiency in bioregionalism, when you own your means of production are things that are for in satisfying our needs. Then you actually have the ability to say no. We don't have the ability to say no right now, and bioregionalism would build that capacity for communities to say no, we don't want to do that. And I think that's the only antidote to this devolution in fascism that we're seeing right now.
Thank you, Gaya. Indy, over to you. And I'll just note that I'm tracking the sidebar, and
Brilliant.
Some of these questions are essentially being answered, even if the original question wasn't there. So, folks, please trust that that we'll try to get to the questions, as many questions as we can. So, Indy, over to you on the bioregionalism angle.
So I'm going to start by saying, obviously, we love bioregionalism, right? But I'm going to present the other side of it. I mean, we do a lot of work on that landscape, but I think it's really important for us to have a complete conversation together, because I think if we can't have this conversation here, we can have it nowhere else, right? So it's really important that I think, as we are seeing many countries adopt a delusionary approach of self-sufficiency, right? The UK cannot be self-sufficient, whether it's microchips or toasters, because it doesn't have the infrastructure. It doesn't matter, microchip or toasters, you can go all the way down. It's questionable if it can do pencils, right? Like just to sort of like I think there's a sort of, and I just want to say that because I think there's a delusional attractor of self-sufficiency which I think is a really risky deep attractor. It's a really risky deep attractor because actually it unbundles paper clips, possibly. It unbundles the entanglement that we are actually living in at the planetary scale. At the same point, it's super clear most watersheds are connected to atmospheric rivers. Right? So there is no, we can look downstream and go, oh, I'm going to protect my watershed. But if you lose the AMOC current, you effectively lose the atmospheric rivers and the continuity of those atmospheric rivers. So there's no boundary around a watershed. The watershed is also just a series of other linkages at the planetary scale. Migratory species, all sorts of things that are actually linked. So bioregionalism is not a boundary problem. Bioregionalism is a fundamentally different class of problem to states. And I think it's really important because I think the political desire is to construct bioregionalism into a boundary problem, i.e., hey, this is a bioregion where we can build self-sufficiency to ourselves. Bioregionalism is a different way for life to relate all the way fractally all the system. I think it's really important to hold that conceptual problem because I think it opens up a different way of how we engage. Because I do believe we are going to see the rise of environmental right as the volatility increases. That environmental right will drive us towards quasi-synthetic protectionism. That protectionism is not going to be able to deliver stability. So even in energy, right, UK cannot, if you were to bound the UK and you say UK is energy self-sufficient, but in boundary, the cost of energy goes up, I think, by something like, if I remember the numbers, I think it's like 150 to 180% increase in energy costs. Because to get to that, whereas if you were to couple UK with France and Portugal and Norway, the cost of that energy goes significantly lower because what you have to do is you have to price in those failure moments at a 1 or 2% that become too significant. So there is a system scale. So what can you do in a bioregion? What can you do in a network of bioregions? What can you do in a regional landscape? What can you do at a planetary landscape? And I think we have to start to preserve this idea of entanglement at every scale in space and time. And that's a different way of organizing at the level of how we're thinking. And it opens up for me a whole bunch of questions about, and this is where I think the language of bioregionalism has locked us into the regional aspect of it slightly, whereas I think it's almost regioning. It's a sort of living in a scale. It's a verbing process rather than a nouning process. And I know I'm being pedantic about language, but a language constructs politics and politics constructs the other kind of boundary problems that we sit into. So I think there's something I just wanted to set that frame out because I think the frame, just at the highest, apologies for it being slightly philosophical, but I think the problem space that we're dealing with is this nested entanglement problem space, not a new boundary problem space. And if we fall into the new boundary problem space, I think we don't get there for lots of good reasons, like atmospheric rivers move and also recognizing every bioregion is going to move about 100 miles north and 100 miles south as we start to see the scale of climate breakdown effects. So already we're going to have to be able to talk about these evolutions as handovers of responsibility and soil governance in different ways into those frameworks. Sorry, I hope that helps.
Great. No need to apologize there, Indy. So again, really great questions coming in here. I'm going to cluster sort of two questions, and that may carry us through. There is one question I want to ask last, but I'm going to cluster together two sets of questions from multiple folks. So one of them is from Jim Horsfield and Mitsui Guerrero, which is essentially the rural-urban divide, and in particular, sort of how do we manage that in bioregionalism? How is there, sort of productive intersectionality between the sort of current scales or densities, as they said? And then another cluster of questions is around, how do we use our existing logics to solve problems that our existing logics created? So how do we essentially create system change working from the system that created those. That was Catherine Ellen von Steckelberg, Menno Lenmers, and Mitsui Guerrero asked sort of versions of that question. So those two sets of questions, and I'll put it out to the both of you. Gaya, you're off mute, so over to you first. And you can handle both or just choose one.
Yeah, I will start with the latter one, the pathways, because that's something that I mean that is the key question. I think there's a very clear difference between sort of the destination frameworks that we want to go towards, like what I call well-being economics, and how the pathway of getting us there. That's an entirely different thing. In a well-being economy, I don't think billionaires should exist. I don't think they will exist, or it's not a well-being economy. You wouldn't be able to accumulate to that extent. But for me, if we're talking about limits, there would be a limit on wealth set way below $1 billion. So that's, but at the same time, right now, we're working with any billionaire we could get to get more funding towards these to get this pathway funded, because it's the only way we can get it done. We can't, U.S. government is not going to do it. And the private companies are funding the opposite mostly. So it's a very it's a bit of, yeah, you're functioning as a bridge if you're walking in this pathway, which is not for the faint of heart, I think. I would like to say just briefly to Indy's point, I think that also this pathway is relevant there as well. We need to become more self-sufficient. That's not to say that we can we have the idea that we can everywhere be completely self-sufficient. But I think trading it's a very different dynamic when your most basic needs can be met. When you do have the ability to at least feed and clothe and house yourselves, you're still entering into that trade from a much different point than if you're completely disempowered. So the dynamics would change, but I don't think that bioregional is necessarily being completely self-sufficient and not having any connection. I think quite the opposite, but I think it would be much more flourishing dynamics precisely because you don't fully need each other for survival, to not die of hunger. But I think I think if I trade with you, it's very different if I need you for my daily bread or for my pencils. Like if we're running out of pencils for a little bit, we will make do. It's very different for really the basic needs. So I think the pathway that's why I started with the changing your inner narrative. I think there's definitely a risk of it that you recreate. I think part of this is also, I think very purposefully our imagination has been dulled over generations really by the current economic system. And I think part of this is also going back to discovering what gives us joy and really healing internally before we go out to set up a new system, because I agree, there is a danger of recreating that otherwise. And that's why I always emphasize start at a deeply personal level and then see how you connect with others. You should always work together. By yourself, you can't do anything in systems change. Connect with others that share that narrative, and together build that out in the cracks of the system. Indy, I want to give you the opportunity to say something too.
Indy, over to you on those two questions.
Bill, could I ask you to say the questions again? I have to be.
Yeah, so one of them was essentially there's the potential of an urban-rural divide in the bioregional movement, and what are ways that we can address that, and I'll add in ways that continue to respect bioregional carrying capacities. And then the other one was really how do we are embedded in existing systems, existing logics. How do we actually, and those logics sort of created the problems. How do we bootstrap our way outside of our circumstances?
Okay, brilliant. Thank you so much, Bill. So number one, I think what we're seeing is a move towards city bioregion conversations and an integrated conversation. So where the demand side risks are and the supply side capacity, the integration of those two positions, I think will become a critical thing. It's also integrating at the level of foundational systems, energy, water, um, critical continuity of nutrition supply. So I think there is a kind of reintegration of the urban and the rural into a kind of into an integrated framework. We've seen lots of movement from the supply side innovation, but I think there's going to be equivalent capacity from the demand side. I think cities are starting to see their systemic vulnerability and starting to want to integrate that. There is currently no unit of interaction space problem between urban municipalities. I think one of the biggest worrying thing that I've seen in urban innovation is that what I would call trying to solve the problem within an urban context, which I think is completely delusional. If you look at the numbers in terms of water, nutrition supply, it's just delusional, and it ends up being fig leaf posturing rather than actually taking a systemic provisioning approach that's really critical. So I think the unit of change has to become both the demand and supply side as an integrated unit on basic city bioregions. So we're seeing this sort of transformation. We're seeing movements of bioregions to reach out to cities. We're seeing cities go the other way. We now need to build a multi-municipal pathway of organizing at the bioregion level. That piece of infrastructure is really critical to allow for these alliances to be built. So that's kind of like the unit of change question. I think we're starting to see those trends already on the ground. And I think they're fundamental. And the other reality is most cities, most super large cities, their biological footprint is just massive. So what you start to see is, well, where are the viable cities that are able to hold continuity in the face of volatility? And I think continuity will become a key measure of value. So where is the kind of landscapes of continuity provision of energy, water systems? I think becomes a key thing. So if I'm a system level investor, I'm looking for those risk and volatility effects. I'm looking for the stability points. It's number one. Where am I seeing the pathways? Like I say, we're seeing, I think so many pathways are opening up that just weren't visible. I mean, I just came off a call on sort of looking at transition financing of farmers and how do you restructure farming debt in different ways. There's some incredible conversations going on at that level, all the way through to new forms of needing new forms of transnational development banks for glacier governance. I think we're seeing vast amounts of pathways. I think one of the most interesting thing I'd say is we are no longer in a paradigm of where we're having to call for moral brilliance from people. I just need them to be smarter. I don't need them to be morally brilliant. I just need them to perceive the risks that they are actually holding with sufficient intelligence to have an intelligent debate about those risks, because the risks are now real, they're visible. I mean, you're seeing that. So I think I'm maybe the biggest signature point I'd say is I no longer think we're living in a moral case that needs to be built. I think I'm just asking for intelligence or relative intelligence.
Thank you, Indy. And I'm going to follow up on that. I think we've got time for one more before the final question. So one of them is from Raman Frey, and he said, can current AI models effectively sense make and guide our choices in a context of massive causal complexity? And I know that's one that you've thought a lot about. So maybe over to you first on that, Indy. We'll reverse the order, and then to you, Gaya. And then I do have one final question for the both of you.
Brilliant. Always easy questions. Thanks, Rowan. So the things I worry about is this is the way I'm thinking about this. There's two points of distraction, sort of challenge with the whole AI conversation. One is AI has the potential to be a runaway control instrument, and that domination capacity that it starts to provide is so significant that it is any civilization that doesn't have access to it becomes effectively a vassal state. That is what is currently driving the economics of AI, the macroeconomics of AI. It is done because any state that doesn't have that sort of runaway technology becomes effectively a vassal state. This is driving resource, energy, water, dumping into this landscape at speed because it's perceived as an existential threat, not long term, but almost within horizons of the next 2 to 3 years. If you then look at the labor displacement problem that we're starting to see, which I think is under discussed, as a really relatively brilliant essay that was put up on Substack 2 days ago, which shifted markets in the US. On the level of labor displacement we're seeing, I think my next part is the level of automation. We're looking at losing 80%, 18% of logistics sort of provision, human provision, but of the total labor economy is 18%. We'll likely lose most of that in the next 2 to 3 years. That discounts any form of middle class jobs, that discounts all the other things. So we're talking about a massive labor destabilization at the same time. So this, I think, is where the crisis of our social contract comes much quicker than other parts of our risk. So I think on the positive side, I think it is also important to recognize, I think these sorts of technologies, generative AI technologies, also give us the capacity to organize in fundamentally a different model. They don't have to be rooted in instructionalism, they can be rooted in learning. So we could start to build a new theory of organizing rooted in learning, which would actually allow for maximizing our surface area of operating in complexity in a way that we've never been able to do with analog bureaucratic systems rooted in partial theories of control. So there is a potentiality on the system, but currently that potentiality is being locked and controlled by those that have capital that see that we should preserve that control theory. And I think there's a different potentiality that sits on there. But I think there is an existential cascade risk now associated with these sorts of technologies on both a medium horizon, but also a labor displacement horizon, and how quickly that starts to undermine the social contract.
Great, thanks, Indy. Gaya, comments on that, on the AI question?
Yeah, for me, this is ultimately AI for me is still a technological tool. And you saw in the limits to growth as well, people criticize limits to growth as that you don't take into account technological innovation, which isn't true. There was literally a technological innovation rate in the model. But the thing with technology is it's ultimately really just a tool, and it will be put to work towards the goal of the overall system it is part of. So that's why AI right now is mostly being used for any kind of extractive purposes. It's from fracking for gas to fracking our minds for attention. And it has an enormous potential, of course, in circular solutions, in optimizing the intermittent energy flows from renewable energy. And that it's used for that as well, but mostly it's used for extractive purposes that take up way too much water, energy, and that kind of thing, as Catherine also pointed out. So for me, it's Karen Howe wrote a very interesting book last year, Empires of AI, and really these tech companies are the new empires in that sense. I guess I have a slightly different attitude towards AI. I'm not as impressed with it as some other people are. I think ultimately it's just another level that's built on an economic system that ultimately still rests very much within the ecosystem. And so I don't think it's gonna. I think it's entirely possible it will come down a lot with collapse as well. We hear talks about AI being a bubble right now. I think that's true, and I'm not sure. I think it will definitely survive. It will be there for the rest of our lives in our future, but I think we will get a little bit of a recheck in our expectations of what it can do for us in humanity. And yeah, I think limits will remind us a little bit to go back to basics and to appreciate what biological, corporal things have to offer, rather than think that AI is going to deliver that. It does feel a little bit to me as what I feel is almost a religious belief. People believe in technology because it's related to this other story that we have. We can't we're selfish maximizers. So the best thing we can hope is for technology to save us in that story of separation. And I don't think it's true. We have to save ourselves. We can use AI as a tool, but ultimately it does come down to us doing that and using it for the right purposes. And in other situations, because of its enormous environmental footprint, say no, we're not going to use it for that.
Oh, thank you, Gaya. I'm going to ask everyone's leave to not leave and just take one more question. Then I know Ralph has some final issues. So of course we're right at the bottom of the hour. If folks need to drop off, that's fine. But in particular, Gaya and Indy, if you're able to stay on just a few moments, there's one final question. Gaya, you kind of teed it up perfectly by making this shift from the technological to the somatic, the embodied, the human, if you will. So a couple of folks wrote questions about the role of fear or other emotions, particularly in relation to collapse. That being sort of like a deregulating emotion. So how can we deal with those emotions? But perhaps this is the question I really want to end on. This is Peter Whitehouse's, does beauty have a limit? So I'll put that over to the two of you. Let's go at maybe in reverse order this time, Indy and then Gaya.
Yeah, no, totally. Does beauty have a limit? No. But that also requires us to expand our theory of what it means to be human. And I think we have a very narrowed theory of the imagination of being human, reduced into units of labor. And I think we've been trying to stretch it with kind of words like well-being and stuff like that. But I actually think we need a fundamentally greater, deeper conversation about what it means to be human. I think the science of that is extraordinary right now, and what's available in terms of how we differentiate what it means to be human and how a human being thinks, even at just the brain level. I've just put in a document around, this is just my first initial explorations around rethinking what it means to be human from a kind of re-examining how humans compute fundamentally different from any form of AI and what the layered of that compute is. And a compute is a really bad word for it, but I think it just puts an idea in it. So I would say, yes, beauty is infinite, but it also requires us fundamentally reimagine the infinite possibility of being human. And I think we've massively been reductive of our imagination of being human, which I think is much more interesting challenge than actually even AI is. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Indy. Gaya, over to you for the last word here.
Yeah, you can answer this in many different ways, of course. I guess I'm gonna be a little bit contrarian and go to the opposite of what Indy said, and say yes, beauty is limited, but also that is precisely it's almost what beauty is. Beauty is really on that edge where you reach the limit. We don't want perfection. You typically find the most attractive people, the most cool products are the things that reside on that limit, and what earlier was almost interpreted as a flaw or failure. But you see, as soon as, for example, now we're doing this vinyl thing again, because we had CDs and we had MP3s and that was flawless, and because of the flawlessness, now we like this whole old style, the imperfection of the vinyl again. And I think this is also with humans, the beauty. You cannot really see beauty unless it is limited. When it's boundless, the value of it dissipates endlessly as well. So I would say there's really the limits and are completely necessary to really appreciate any kind of beauty.
Well, Gaya, ending with an ode to the beauty of vinyl for a record lover like me really lands on welcome ears. So thank you very much, Gaya, Indy. Thank you so much. And we've really only, in some ways, touched the tip of the iceberg. There's so many great questions. Thanks to everyone for asking such great questions. We've harvested them, and so we'll make those the full list of questions available to folks. But thanks to the both of you for your time, your thoughtfulness, and your interaction with us. Ralph, over to you for some final things.
Thank you very much. And it's always difficult to sort of close off a session like this, but I'll make it short. Just a couple of things that I want to alert you guys to again. This is the Bioregion Open Dialogues landing page on our website, where all of these dialogues are available. And the one of today will be available as of tomorrow. So we'll work very hard to get this already posted. It will also be available on our YouTube channel. So, and that adds to the 7 other dialogues that we already had. I already also mentioned that we have this Bioregional Carrying Capacities series where we also had more than half a dozen of these sessions. They are also available on our website, and you both find them under the bioregioning tab on the top of the website. I also want to alert you to our conference of this year. It's already our 13th annual R3.0 conference. And again, it's fully devoted to bioregioning, called Bioregional Regeneration as Collapse Resilience, Earth-Centric Biocultural Kinship, Knowledge and Governance. And that means that you already have the sort of like the 3 main topics that we're going to discuss. It's going to happen on 3 consecutive days, on the 8th, 9th, and 10th of September. And each day has a content session and 2 follow-up debriefs for our so-called confluences. And that is what this next page already shows. We are continuing a model that we started 2 years ago and was also very successful last year, where we had 50 bioregional groups from all over the world on 6 different planets who were planning local events side by side with the online conference that we are actually holding. And this we are going to continue this year as well on 3 consecutive days, 8, 9, and 10th of September. And then we have 2 debrief sessions on the evening of the same day and then on the morning of the next day. That, of course, is dependent on where you are and which time zone you are, but we're trying to make it accessible for most of the time zones on this planet so that it can actually follow both the content, but then also the debrief session. That brings together, last year it brought together around about 400 people all over the world. We think that this will most likely double this year. So it is a model to sort of decrease footprint and to increase handprint as much as we can through this bioregional confluence delivery model. So again, this is going to happen in September. And at the same time, we're also, for all of those in the confluencing community, we also have a monthly call where we are learning from each other. And just as an example, in our February 2026 Spotlight session, which we just had, we had a presentation from the Po River bioregion in Switzerland and Italy, presented by the Monviso Institute. And in March, later in March, we're going to have the Mornington Peninsula bioregion in Australia. So many of these 50 different bioregions come together on a monthly basis to learn from each other. And that's an ongoing flow of learning opportunity in these monthly calls. And that's in preparation and after the conference with these specific confluences. I also want to mention that we have set up a R3.0 confluencing fund because we also want to financially support the confluences or the different bioregions for holding these confluences. We are aiming at fundraising $50,000 to be able to support all of these confluences. We have first donations in, but there's a lot of space still, and we're going to accept donations until the end of August. And then we need to see how we share the funds. All of the money that goes into that fund goes to the confluences and is helping the confluences to actually finance their local events while screening the conference online. So that's it for today. We both want to thank you, both Bill and myself. This has again been a fascinating dialogue, and as said, is going to be available from tomorrow onwards, and then can be shared widely amongst yourselves and all of those that are interested in really sharing it with others in your own networks. And yeah, there will be another of these dialogues in about a month's time. So just we keep you posted. And if you're not yet registered to our monthly newsletter, please go to our website, www.r3-0.org, subscribe to the newsletter, and then you have all the updates of when next meetings are going to happen. Okay, that was it. Only 10 minutes over, but we're done for today. Thanking you very much. Thanking both Indy and Gaya for your valuable contributions and for your time to be together with us for such a long time. And saying goodbye for today and see you back soon.
Thanks, everyone. I'll just piggyback one quick thing is that Alexander Sterling from Turtle Island Community Capital has confirmed for our next open dialogue, and we're in conversation with a couple of other organizations. So hang tight for more information on that next one, but we know we're going to have Alexander speaking with us. So stay tuned to our newsletter and social media and our website for more on that. Thanks, everyone. Take care.